Day, everyone. This is your teacher, Ms. Mars, and on today's video lecture, I am going to continue my discussion on Unit 4. Unit 4, specifically Lesson 3. So previously, you learned about Lesson 2, and that is the materials for teaching vocabulary. On today's video lecture, it will be Lesson 3, and that will be materials for the teaching of reading skills. So without further ado, I know you all are ready. Let's begin. Okay, class, now we have with us our PowerPoint presentation on Lesson 3. On Lesson 3, as what I mentioned, it will be all about materials for developing reading skills. So one of the most important skill that we have to develop when we learn a language is, of course, reading. So let's now take a look at this lesson in deep. So the reading behavior of L2 learners very important. The language that we are talking about in our context is obviously the English language. So we have to make sure that we know the L2 learners' reading behavior. That's why as early as they are in their beginner level, we already teach them reading. And they are already exposed to so many reading activities. So when you read the following quotation from Orbach and Paxton in 1997, would you be able to guess the ages, levels, and nationalities of the L2 learners mentioned? So many learners feel they have to know all the words in a text in order to understand it, rely heavily on the dictionary, are unable to transfer positive L1 reading strategies or positive feelings about translation and attribute their difficulties to a lack of language proficiency. Thus, relying heavily on dictionary is not really encouraged, okay? It's being discouraged not to rely heavily on dictionary is that because it would hinder the learner to have a positive feelings on translation, and also in order for them to overcome their difficulties to a lack of language proficiency, not relying too much on dictionary is important, especially if the word is being used in a text. So I believe it would really be okay if we make use of the clues that we can find in the context for us to know the meaning of the vocabulary. Approaches to materials for teaching reading. So we have here the language-based approaches. The language-based approaches to reading seems to have gained support at least twice in English language teaching, or ELT. If we are going to take a look at it, it definitely have been first in 1950s to 1960s. Then it also garnered support in 1980s until the present. So the dominant view around the 1950s and 1960s was that once learners acquired the habit of language use through learning grammar and lexis, they would become able to read fluently. Language use is obviously when you use the language that you have learned, let's say vocabulary, everything that you have learned, you use it, you have the avenue to use it that would allow you to become a fluent reader. That's according to Fries in 1963. The language-based teaching of reading was questioned when it became evident in the 1970s that understanding the linguistic meaning of a text does not equal understanding of the textual meaning. So the linguistic meaning of a text, according to the argument raised during the 1970s, does not understand the textual meaning. So strong support for the language-based approaches to reading came from eye movement studies. So there have been, arguments and supporting and people not supporting the language-based approaches to teach reading to our learners have been like fluctuating in terms of support. So like we know the era or when it was being supported. So probably it's not evident or it's not being supported in 1970s because of this argument that they gave. So Adams in 1994 maintains that a text in English seems to be read by fluent readers in what is essentially a left to right, line by line, word by word process. So we have two read it line by line, and we have to process it word for word. That's according to Adams. And if that's the case, when we do everything from left to right, we read it like, of course, we read from left to right, and then we also read it line by line, and we process it word by word. That is, according to her, is, you know, would allow the learners to be fluent in grammar. She explains that in general, skillful readers visually process virtually each letter of every word they read, translating print to speech as they go. So, actually, when we talk about skillful readers, they process virtually each letter of every word they read. Like they don't skip a single word. Because every word is essential in the text, even if it is a function word, okay, not a content word, they also are very important. And then translating print to speech as they go. They do so whether they are reading isolated words or meaningful connected text. They do so regardless of the ease or difficulty of the text, regardless of its semantic, syntactic, or orthographic predictability. When we say difficulty of the text, semantic, we are talking about the meaning. Syntactic, we are talking about the sentence structure. And the orthographic, we're talking about the spelling. There may be no more broadly or diversely replicated set of findings in modern cognitive psychology than those that show that skillful readers visually process nearly every letter and word of text as they read. The skillful those people who are not skillful in terms of reading actually just skip words that they know. They don't process it. And if they don't process it, that means they weren't able to fully grasp the meaning of the text that they have read. Okay. The language-based approach to reading appears to have regained support in claiming that in order to read fluently, the readers need general language ability. That is one. Okay. When you know the grammar, everything about language, you would be able to process and read fluently, and especially automatic word recognition. That's true. If you have difficulty to recognize the word, then it would be so difficult to understand what you have read. So that is why vocabulary is very important. Building vocabulary is very important in reading and understanding the language. A language-based approach is you learn the conventions, or you know things about the language that you are learning, and then out from there, when you also read, it would be easier for you to comprehend. And then goals, how to use literature for language practice. Our goal here is, of course, making use of literature so that the student or the learners can practice the language. Literary texts, okay? And then we have here resources, and then provide stimulating language activities. So what literary texts, the resource that we have, and out from that, we can provide stimulating language activities to our learners. Vocabulary studies also seem to indicate that fluent reading requires what are the requirement? Fast and automatic word identification. Class, pag familiar ang words and we were able to recognize and the word, we have the recognition of the word, then there is fluency in reading. Extensive knowledge of the lexicon. Okay, lexicon is very important, ha, kanang mga words nato gyud. So kung daghan ta og vocabulary, that is very important, especially that now we are learning English. So that's why reading is a must for us to know also vocabulary. The ability to attribute the most appropriate meanings to lexical items in relation to their context and context. So sa context niya o sa context. Okay? So how it is used, and at the same time, its relationship with the text and the other text. The skill strategy based approaches. So skill learning was used by the proponents of the communicative approach in the 1970s. The word was often contrasted with knowledge or conceptual learning. In knowledge learning, for example, learners learn words in the target language consciously and verbally. So it's very important if we talk about now strategy-based, ganiha di ba language-based approach. Karon, na nasad tayo gitog og skill or strategy-based approaches. So the skill learning, it was used by the proponents of the communicative approach in the 1970s. We will be talking here about Campbell. They were the ones, she was one of them, who talk about communicative approach. And then the word was often contrasted with knowledge or conceptual learning. In knowledge learning class, for example, learners here learn words in the target language with consciousness, and they also learn it verbally. So in skills learning, on the other hand, learners acquire the sensor. Okay, the sensor, those are capable of our senses, motor and cognitive abilities. Motor for our movements, and cognitive, our brain for understanding, necessary for using a language in an accurate, fluent, and appropriate manner. Williams and Moran in 1989 note that with respect to the term skill and strategy, we will be looking into both research literature class and at the same time the teaching materials as considerable terminological inconsistency. So research literature and at the same time teaching materials, because the teaching materials, it's they contain the strategy how we could be able to develop our reading, our skill in reading. Okay, and then the value of teaching discrete reading skills is controversial, but remember, course books continue to provide activities designed to nurture these skills. So the value of teaching discrete reading skills, that is controversial. Okay, though the course books that we are buying, the course books that we are reading, they continue to provide activities that could nurture the reading skills. Okay, so developing materials for language teaching, her review of reading materials says that, according to Nuttall, that it is possible to promote reading skills and strategies. It is still largely a matter of faith, but the number of materials produced show that it is a faith widely held. So, daghan ako no, okay, materials that are allowing our students to be able to learn how to read through the strategy-based approach. The notion of strategy started to emerge in the materials of the mid 1980s. So actually, class learning or developing the reading skills, it also needs really the proper strategy. And I'm not saying that there is only single strategy that we can use, but there are a lot. Still, it depends on the learning style. It depends on what suits the learners best. What the skill or strategy-based reading approaches seem to share in common are, number one, a view that in order to read effectively, readers need a range of skills and strategy. So this is what is being, really proposed. We need skills, okay? Dapat na atay skill sa pagbasa. At the same time, we have the strategy how to do it. The skill, obviously, it would be developed if we also know the language. How would we acquire a skill if we have zero knowledge about a language that we are learning? An awareness that different readers may have different reading problems. So if that's the case, diba, pag lain-lain og reading problems, that means there is no such term as single strategy that would work for everybody in order to develop our skill in reading. A view that guided practice will help learners learn necessary skills and strategies. So guided practice meaning you don't do it by yourself, but rather you have guide step-by-step process and how you do it. It could be there is a teacher guiding you, or it could be you follow a certain course books. So if we are going to create a material that would allow our learners to develop their reading skill, then we have to make sure they are guided properly. And then we have the schema-based approaches. The schema-based approaches would be basically based on what you have learned in the past or in the previous, mga pre-reading. No? Williams and Moran 1989, point out the influence of schema theory and the ubiquitous pre-reading activity in English as foreign language materials in the 1980s. So, of course, schema theory, what you have learned in the past, typical pre-reading activities. Muna mga pre-reading activities para you have already a prior experience and it would be easier for you. Asking learners first to discuss in pairs or in groups their personal experience that basically is related to the topic of or the lesson. Asking learners to consider statements, text titles, and illustrations that is relevant to their experience and also related to the topic that you are going to discuss so that you can develop the reading skill. Some materials try to provide learners with a series of texts designed to achieve a critical mass. For example, sufficient background knowledge about a certain theme to enable readers to achieve successful comprehension. Kinahanglan magud class, we have to let the students be set. Okay, set ang ilang mind that is what they are going to learn. So you can have the pre-reading activity by allowing them to get something out from their previous experience. Thus, combined with the emphasis on situations and context and the communicative approach, teaching materials which group text by topics seem to have become popular, and this practice still continues to this day. That's according to Tomlinson and Masuhara in 2013, and that is true, no? Until now, we are using it. So there are alternative approaches to materials for teaching reading. Principle 1, we can have engaging effect should be the prime concern of reading materials. So engaging, that means we should allow our learners to be engaged. In materials for teaching L2 reading, however, texts often seem to be selected because they yield to teaching points. Okay, so for language teaching, vocabulary, syntax, we have discourse structure, skill strategies, etc. Sometimes certain texts are selected because they are easy or they fit the theme of the unit. Mathewson, 1994, makes an interesting observation on the sharp contrast between the teacher's positive interest in effect and the seeming lack of interest among researchers. So now, nanay contrasting observation si Mathewson. The teacher has a positive interest, diba? Pero naman po, ang researchers basically a very, lack of interest. So that is something that should be considered. He compared the contents and titles in teachers' journals against those in research publications. So nag-contrast na siya. Principle 2. Listening to a text before reading, it helps decrease linguistic demands and encourages learners to focus on meaning. So what should come first is the text, okay, before you read it. And we decrease her linguistic demands. Linguistic demands that is too structured and that is confining our learners in the box. But rather, we just have to focus on the meaning, okay? Masuhara in 2007-2009 points out that the established view of reading in cognitive psychology and neuroscience that writing systems are in fact coded spoken language seems to have been somewhat overlooked in the literature of applied linguistics and reading research. Talal in 2003 emphasized that reading language must stand on the shoulder of oral language and that we have to focus also on meaning, not focusing too much on the linguistic structure. Masuhara in 2009 argues that sufficient oral language proficiency is a prerequisite for L2 fluent reading. So, pag sufficient ka, you have an oral language proficiency, you will be able to be fluent in reading. But if you don't have that sufficiency, there is so much difficulty in reading. And of course, it would come also with a rich vocabulary that you have in your brain or that you have in your bank, self-bank. Okay, in L1, the initial 5 years of life is spent on oral language acquisition, diba? We are born, toddlerhood, we just imitate, we speak, we don't write. So that is, if it in L2, it should have been like that, but it's a bit difficult, okay? Even the L1 children can only learn to read gradually with a lot of difficulty. So a major difficulty for L2 learners, now we're talking about our English language, beginning to read is the fact that reading requires learners to decode visual stimuli. We have chunk syntactic and semantic units, extract meaning from the text and integrate it with the relevant memories in order to create the overall meaning of the text. And then a teacher reading the text to the students can make it accessible to the learners by number one, you can take away the cognitive load of processing scripts and sounds at the same time. So you better do it. Okay, you um let them give first, like for example hatag sa nimo ang mga unfamiliar words, and then give them the meaning para wa na kay sila have a burden in terms of understanding, because they were already able to come across with a word and sounds at the same time. So you have to do it, okay? Muna ang inyong prior pre-reading activities. Chunking a text into meaningful and manageable lengths to help the learners gradually interpret the meaning. So i-chunk na to, especially if you are teaching the beginners. So we chunk first the sentence, and then out from the chunk we are going to give the meaning unsa may gibot pasabot aning nga word, and then adding prosodic features such as prominence that marks situationally informative pragmatic meaning. Prosodic, the suprasegmentals. Achieving impact through reading a text with suitable effect. Diba? Affect. Example, na humor or the emotions that you have, anger, and the likes. Principle 3, reading comprehension means creating multidimensional mental representation in the reader's mind. So kinahanglan na ay mental representation. Experiment 1, example. Read the following definition of the Japanese word sho. A wind instrument made of groups of slim and void bamboo stems. So with that, you are creating now a mental representation. Kaya mo man siyang describe, and that is used in traditional Japanese music. Reflect upon what effect the definition of the word had on you. Diba? Nag-imagine ka. Experiment number 2, read the following definition of a Japanese fruit. A round fruit which grows in a tree and which has a smooth red, yellow, or green skin and firm white flesh inside it. What can this fruit be? So with that, you are also trying to imagine. So muna siya class, in fact, kana bitong mga radio drama. In fact, when we read also novel, one of the most important skill that a writer should have is to know how to tell it or know how to show it to the readers. Don't tell, show. Okay? Don't tell it, but rather show it. So when you show it, you let the reader see it and imagine it. Wa ka nagstorya, but you are showing it. You are not telling it. Wala ni mo gistorya sa reader, but you are showing it through descriptions and making a scene very vivid to the reader's minds. If you, because that is one of the principle manggod in writing, especially creative writing, show, don't tell. And how would you show it is by making it very descriptive and making it very clear that the reader can picture out exactly what you want them to think or what you want them to imagine. Experiment 3, imagine an apple. What has happened? What has happened in your mind? So the first and second experiments are what I call unidimensional processing. You extract the meaning from the linguistic code that you read. As a whole, readers of this poem might have, as a whole, readers of this poem might have experienced a series of snapshots or movie-like dynamic images with possibly sounds and smells as well. What you have created in your minds is a mental representation of the poem. Diba? What is interesting about this mental representation is that each reader's representation is dynamic and it can be unique and depending on the individual's mental state, mood, experience, and etc. Now, when you allow a mental representation, it also depends on the reader. So the mental representation now, it's relative. You can't really also expect that even if how clear it is that you presented it, the way the reader would imagine it may be different based on their mental state, mood, experience, etc. Okay, if kung ang reader ay class na siya mga ang reader, if na siya mga hallucinations or something, di ba? He or she could really think it differently. And principle 4, materials should help learners experience the text first before they draw their attention to its language. In L1 reading, we focus on meaning. Reading materials should offer activities that help the learner focus on the content of the text and achieve personal experience of it through multidimensional representation. By experiencing the text, learners are able to, number 1, activate the sensory, motor, emotional, cognitive areas of their brain. Number 2, self-project and self-invest in the activities, which lead to deeper processing and to fuller engagement. Number 3, have time to make errors and adjustments in connecting verbal codes with nonverbal mental representations. Number 4, they have time to talk to themselves in their first language. And number 5, they have time to develop inner speech in their L2 before they can speak or write in public. The readers of this chapter might have noticed that many of the conditions listed above accord with what has been suggested as the characteristics of the optimal learning environment if we are going to consider the second language acquisition theories of Ellis in 2008, Ortega in 2009, and Tomlinson in 2011. The most important principle, class, in providing the experience of the text is to sequence the activity so that the learners can experience the text first before they analyze it. Regardless of our developmental stage, we actually never stop processing the L1 in multidimensional ways. So we always consider it not only in one dimension, but so many. Kaya nga multidimensional eh. But somehow, L2 learners, we tend to be on a diet. Nga naman, this is not our language. We could be unidimensional. We only look at it the linguistic side, diba? Analytical approaches to language from beginners, level to advanced. So in the L2, even in the foreign language, we tend to be unidimensional or very limited lang. Pero pag L1, lahat-lahat, diba? No wonder L2 learners are not so successful in achieving multidimensional mental representation when they use the L2. Ano man class, ang L1, we use it in everyday. Mauna itong gigamit sa community. So that's why we could learn it in many ways, many facets. Kaya nga multidimensional. Pero sa L2, very limited ang atong exposure, right? We learn it from teachers, but when we go home, we don't speak English. So that's why it's very limited. It could even be just unidimensional. Samot na ang foreign language. So no wonder L2 learners are not so successful in achieving multidimensional mental representation when they use the L2. So that's it, class, for our lesson 3, which is all about the materials for developing reading skills. So I hope you were able to grasp our different principles that I shared. And next video lecture, we will tackle about lesson 4, which is materials for developing writing skills. So I hope, class, you learn a thing or two from our video lecture this morning. So thank you very much once again for learning with me. And I will see you on the next video lecture that will be lesson 4, materials for developing writing skills. Thank you very much all for watching. This is again your teacher, Miss Mars. Bye-bye.